All right, in this lecture I'm going to talk a little bit more about working with geometries using the ArcPy package, of course. So we're going to talk about things like points, arrays, polylines, and polygons. So essentially, how do we create geometry from the very specific points which have x and y coordinates, and how we make arrays, and from there how we can create lines and polygons. So we're going to see the different steps that are necessary here, and of course we're going to work with the insert cursor to create those feature class or shapefiles. Okay, I'm going to explain a little bit how we work with geometries within Python. So as you know, every feature, whether it's a point, a line, or a polygon, is made out of vertices, right? And the vertices have a pair of coordinates x and y. So a point is 0 dimension, so it has only one pair of coordinates. A line has at least two, and a polygon has more than three, but making sure that the first and the last one are the same to have a full enclosure. So each feature in a feature class or in a shapefile consists of vertices, right? I just explained those one. If you want to know the value of those coordinates, you're doing this using the geometry object. Okay, so in Esri products, for instance, if you have a feature class or if you have a shapefile, you're typically going to have an ID or FID, a feature ID, object ID sometimes, and then you have shape. And shape is typically going to be points, lines, or polygon, and there are different kinds also like multi-points and so on. But we're going to stick here with points, lines, and polygon. And so that is where the geometry is essentially stored. So what you do, you typically set a cursor on the geometry field shape. Okay, now you can put a cursor on more than just that particular field. If you want, for instance, the ID, and if you had other attributes, then you could put the cursor onto more fields. And in order to access, we use a geometry token instead of the field name, and that is typically shape add. That's the token. Instead of just writing shape, we say shape add. So here is an example of how this would work. You have import ArcPy. You have a feature class. So for instance, let's say we are talking about roads, and then you have a with statement with ArcPy.da, data access search cursor, the feature class, and then shape add as a cursor. Now, when you have shape add, it gives you access to the entire geometry. So for points, of course, it's just the x and the y coordinates, but for line, it's the length of the line as well as the x and y coordinates of all the vertices. For the polygon, it's the length of the perimeter, is the area, and of course all of the vertices. So sometimes if you have very large data, you may want to just use shape at xy or shape at length to avoid that, to sort of, I guess, make it more efficient as opposed to accessing all the geometry. And then, so once you have your search cursor here, then you can do processing. So for instance, printing the coordinates on the screen, or printing the length of a road segment or the area of a polygon. So that is here the very first step. Now we are going to see how we can create geometry using coordinates for points, lines, and polygon. Next, we are going to talk about geometry objects. So ArcPy has different classes to work with geometry objects. The one that is the generic one is called ArcPy.geometry. Okay, and just to give you an example here, how this works. So you have ArcPy.geometry, and then you have the type of geometry that serves as an argument. So this typically is a point or an array, but we'll see there are actually other kinds. And then the inputs that you want to provide, we'll see that in a second. And then the special reference, sometimes it's necessary if you are creating a new layer from scratch. You may want to specify what coordinates your data is in. So here are the different classes. So besides this one, so this is the generic. These are more specific. ArcPy.point, ArcPy.array, ArcPy.polyline, ArcPy.polygon, ArcPy.multipoint, ArcPy.pointGeometry. Okay, and let's see those two because they are very relevant right now as we are talking about how to create point geometry. So the very first one here, I have a new variable called point, and I put it equal to ArcPy.point, and between the brackets I have the x and y. So these are simply the coordinates, longitude, latitude. that's one example. The other one is this one, point geometry. The variable is equal to arcpy dot point geometry. And what it used the point that just has been created, the point object, and then it adds that number at the end, which is the spatial reference. So there are some codes within Esri and also other commercial GIS software for the spatial reference. So what we see is that this is very limited. It just consider the coordinates, while here it does consider the coordinates, but also spatial reference. So it does have more methods and more property. Next, we're going to spend some time on how it works for lines. Next, we want to see how we can create lines and ultimately polygons from point objects. And so what we're going to use is this arcpy.polyline, and that will contain essentially arrays of points, because as you know, a line is made out of at least 2 points. Of course, it could be more than 2. So I'm showing a simple example here, and the first part of the code is to create a line. The second part is to create another line, and then we're going to see how they can intersect. So what I'm doing here, I'm defining a point, okay, a variable point, and this is going to essentially be a point that is, we saw the arcpy.point earlier, where we have the x and the y coordinates, and so that's a point. You can see here the reference x and y coordinates, axis, sorry. The second point here is created at 100, 100. And so then from these points, you're going to make an array of them, okay? And that array is defined by these 2 points. Now again, as I mentioned, they could be more than 2, then you had point 2, point 3, point 4, and so on. And then you use this array to create that line. So you use this array, these 2 points form an array, and then from there you can create the line using the polyline here function. Now let's suppose that we want to create a second line. Then we would work it in a similar manner. The only difference is that I have given here different names so that we don't overwrite existing names. So we have point 3 and point 4 and array 2 and polyline number 2. And so if I see point 3 is at 100, 0, that's point 3. Point 4 is at 0, 100. And then the second polyline here connects both of them. Now finally, what you can do, for instance, that's kind of interesting, you could see our 2 lines intersecting, which is an important GIS operation when we do overlay. So you can say here, for instance, print the statement because it's going to say true, polyline, so polyline, so this is this one, dot crosses, right? So this is a method. The other line, which is polyline number 2, are these crossing. Of course, visually, we can tell that they are crossing. Behind this crosses method, there is, of course, a lot of mathematics that is not displayed here. But that's an example where from a point geometry, we can create an array, and then from there a line, and then how we can do some operation on 2 lines, for instance. Next up, I'm talking about polygon, how we create a polygon from points, and then points ultimately in an array, and then into a polygon. So I've taken a simple example here where I have a triangle, and it's important to note that so it started at point 1, goes to point 2, then point 3, and then comes back to point 1. Remember the sense of closure where the first and the last point need to be the same. So how would I go about this? So first I'm going to define 3 different points, right? Using, as we saw for the lines, the arcpy.point, so 0, 0, 100, 0, and 50, 50. So that's point 1, 2, and 3. And then essentially I'm going to create an array from these points. But note here that's quite important. Point 1, point 2, point 3, point 1. So there is a repeat between the first and the last one. And then finally, with this array, like I did for a line, I can create a polygon by simply doing polygon is equal to arcpy.polygon, open the brackets, array. And from there, from that polygon, of course, you can, for instance, calculate the perimeter. You could also calculate the area. So for instance, print polygon.area, which is a property of the polygon. So I hope these examples clearly explain how we can create geometry from points to points, from points to line, from points to polygons. Okay. Next, we are going to dive a little bit more into writing geometries. Next up, we want to know how we can write geometry, and this is typically done with an insert cursor, as we have seen in class earlier. So new features are created using the insert cursor. We essentially do 2 things. We create the geometry, and then we are going to use the only method that exists with insert cursor, which is called insert the row. So remember, insert cursor, we're adding new information to either an existing feature class or shapefile or to an empty one that needs to be created. And I think that's important to know that there is this particular function within ArcPy called create feature class management, that if you don't already have a, say, point, line, or polygon shapefile or feature class for that matter, you need to create it. And typically when you create, it requires a few arguments, the path, so that could be a simple path, or it could actually point to a geodatabase in case you have a feature class, the shapefile or feature class name, and then of course whether it's a point, line, polygons. And you could have additional arguments such as the spatial reference. So let's look at an example here about writing geometry. Here simply for a point, we have a point is arcpy.point, and here 2 coordinates 5 and 7. We have seen plenty of example of this earlier. I have an arcpy.da.insert cursor, the feature class that had been defined earlier, and the field, and that is shape at as a cursor. And lastly, then you will do cursor.insert row, and between the brackets you will have points, the point that has been defined earlier. If you leave this empty, then it's simply going to create a new line, but that's not going to have any geometry or any attribute if you had attribute you wanted to add. It's important here to note that I say shape at, but yeah, there is actually only one shape with the points, and that is X and Y. So it's fine if I could use either this one or the other one. You have to be a bit more careful when you use lines or polygon, which is what I'm going to show you next. Okay, lastly, I want to explain how we can write geometries for polygons. Okay, and by the way, this works in very similar manner for lines, and I'll show a couple of examples later on the computer. So we, of course, import ArcPy. We have a point, and here it's important. We're going to define a point as being arcpy.point, and array as being arcpy.array. We're going to define them in the beginning, and we'll see why later. Then I have a set of coordinates. It's a list that is made out of pairs of coordinates. I made sure that the first point and the last point were the same, so that would be closing the polygon. And then I use a for loop, and I say here for coordinates. In coordinates. So I'm going to look at each of these elements separately. Now, if I take that first element, this is going to be coordinate 0, and the tree is going to be coordinate 1. And so what I'm going to do here, the point here, right, it's an object, and this object has a property, and the property is x. So I say point.x, and I assign 5 to that. And then I assign 3 to point.y. So the property here of the point, the y coordinates, okay? And then what I'm going to use, I'm going to create an array from that, array.addPoint, okay? So essentially you are populating this array by adding the information for each point, if you want, and then using that array, you're going to do arcpy.polygon with the array right there, okay? And again, it would work similarly for a line. You could have this the same. Well, here that would be in line that comes back to its same place. But the difference will be you would have arcpy.polyline and then the array right there. Okay, so now we're of course going to spend a little bit of time demonstrating this into ArcPro and the ArcPy environment. Okay, our first example is how we can create a line from points here. What I have is a feature class here called test line, okay? And as you can see, this test line is empty. It does have an object ID, it does have a shape, it does have the shape length, that's normal. Those are geometric attributes when you create a feature class that are automatic. Object ID is also created directly by ArcGIS Pro. So what I want to do is essentially create 2 points and then connect those by line. And you can see here how this is going to work. So besides import ArcPy, I have a cursor here that is using test line. Now, I could also put the entire path where this is located. And then I want to add information based on the shape, okay? So that's what the insert cursor is going to be about. And you also have at the end here, cursor.insert row. Now, in order to have a line, what we need points. And from these points, we're gonna make an array as we saw. So we have 2 points here that coincide with the coordinates, I believe, of Richmond and in Virginia and Raleigh in North Carolina. So I have this arcpy.point, so it creates points based on these coordinates. It creates 2 of them that I put together into an array, okay? And the polyline is going to be made with the array. Once that line is created, I added as an insert row. And so we're going to see that. And at the end you have the delete cursor. This is because I did not use with arcpy.da.cursor as a cursor. So if I had used it, I didn't need to have the delete cursor. So let's run this one. Okay, didn't give any error. That's great. We can refresh the table at the bottom. So I'm going to do it, bring it up here a little bit so you can see. We see that there is a new feature that has been added. Great. And we can see also that the map has been updated. And we have the line from Raleigh to Richmond. What if we wanted to add a line from Raleigh to Richmond? From Raleigh to Charlotte. So let's have a look here. So we would essentially use the very same code. We don't need to import arcpy, it's already there. We want to put the cursor again so it goes back up, and only thing that we need to change are the coordinates here. So the coordinates of Raleigh are given the second one, and so I would have to change the coordinates of Charlotte. And so I follow the same procedure, and if I refresh the table, I now have a second line, and if I refresh the map, I can see that the second line is appearing actually from Raleigh to Charlotte. Here you can see. Okay, so this is the process by which you would create a line. So remember, you have the points, so arcpy.point, the coordinates. From these points you make an array, and from this array you create a polyline, and then eventually you insert the row to make sure that the row has been added. The next example that I would like to demonstrate to you is how you go about creating here a polygon from scratch. In scratch, I mean by using coordinates. The way we're going to do this here is a little bit different, where we are going to define the coordinates here in as a list. Okay, as you know, to make a polygon, you would like to have at least 3 or 4 points. Because we do not have any layers that is created, unlike the other example for the lines here, we're going to use the arcpy management create feature class. I talked about this a little bit earlier. And what we essentially then going to do is that we're going to create an insert cursor that is going to use the coordinates, and in sort of a batch processing is going to insert the row. So it's a little bit different than what we have talked about, but it still kind of follow the same mechanics with the insert row property, method, sorry. So here, let's have a quick look. So we have this different coordinates. I'm just going to make sure that the indentation is correct here. Sometimes a little bit different, and the coordinates here are nicely set up. And this feature class here is going to be saved under the temporary directory. So let's see, and let's run this. Okay, we don't see any error. We see a polygon has been created, and we can look as to where that polygon is by just doing a zoom to layers, and this one is right here. And if we wait a little bit, we'll see where that polygon is, and this is in, I believe, Redlands, which is where the Esri headquarters are located, and I believe this is essentially the campus of Esri. As you can see here. All right, next we are going to see how we can create a line using coordinates from a CSV file. All right, in our last example, we want to show how we can create a linear feature class from a CSV file that contains coordinates of segments. So this could be, for instance, a location of the bird migration route, the different segments there. Could also be the path of an individual, like a space-time path, or could also be, in this example, the coordinates of a flight here between New York and Brussels in Belgium, as it is reported on flightaware.com. So for this dataset, just want to show you briefly what it is. We have the takeoff time at 5:53 p.m. The coordinates, these are the coordinates of Newark in New Jersey, and then from this place to the very next location, and so on and so forth, and the elevation in feet. And you can see that it goes all the way to the end here, so flying at 37,000 feet on average, and then ending up here in Brussels, which is quite high in terms of latitude, and at 4 degrees east. So how to go about this? It's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to show you the code, and we're going to try to explain it step by step. So I've just written the code here in Google Colab. So we do need to import a few libraries, the ArcPy, of course, CSV, and the data, the DA access module, data access module. So we have the workspace where I've put the flightpath.csv, the data I just showed you in the CTAM, and I'm going to basically create empty list here that I'm going to populate when I read the CSV. Okay. I'm of course here also ignoring the first line, which contains headers, and then I populate those empty lists. The next part is to create a new layer that is going to contain that this line feature, because I don't have this layer, and I'm simply going to call it flight.shp, as you can see here. That's the out name. The workspace remains the same. It's a polyline. Okay. Interestingly enough, I'm going to add a couple of fields to this one. One that is going to be called time, and one is going to call elevation. So we're going to keep track of when the plane was at a specific time and at the elevation. I forgot to mention one thing before here. SR is special reference. 4326 is the code for WGS, World Geodetic System. That's what you basically use when you have longitude, latitude, and you're not sure about the coordinate system. And then eventually I will populate the line feature with the coordinates. So here, this is very similar to what we did before. I have a while loop. I could have also used a for loop that is going to go through the entire list, or the length of the list of these observations. And you can see arcpy.point, x origin, y origin, x destination, y destination. So we have 2 points that are defined here with arcpy.point. And we use those to create an array, and then from this array we're going to create a line. Now we have this line that we're going to use, of course, but we're also going to add information such as the elevation, the time, and also an ID here, and then we're using insert row to make that happen. So the code here is already written within the Python window. It's exactly the same code here. And let's see here if at the end I can just press enter. So we see that there is a small error here. So let's just copy paste this again. I see where the error is. I guess right here, and I'm going to make sure that there is not another one of these. Okay, so let's go. And we see that this is now reading through the text file, adding to the empty list, creating the new feature class it's been doing, and now it's populating this new feature class with the data from the list. And so we're just gonna have to wait a little bit of time that it's created. It seems to be finished, so I'm just going to put that aside just in case, and we're going to zoom in to the data set, and we can clearly see now the line with the different segments, starting here from the New York area over the Atlantic and ending up here in Brussels, Belgium, just before it landed. So this is actually quite a nice code if you have, as I mentioned, trajectory data or maybe data about animals and you want to map those out.